Chapter 13. Orchidaceae Negra. A fuzzy grey image before Bond's eyes deepened to black and then throbbed into a non-committal brown. A face appeared, bobbing up and down with the motion of a vehicle moving over rough ground, and Bond recognised the man dressed as a medical orderly who had struck him down on the hillside. Bond closed his eyes again and tried to move his hands. They were tied with cord and resting on his stomach. His legs seemed to be secured with a strap, something pressed down on his forearms. He opened his eyes slightly and saw that a second strap around his chest was holding him down on a stretcher. He was in the back of an ambulance, and beside him was Holly, similarly bound to another stretcher. Between them, with his back to the doors, was seated the complacent bulk of their guard, with eyes like bloodshot marbles. They bulged out of his face as if likely to slide down his cheeks with the next jolt of the ambulance. A small wet tongue washed the man's lips, and Bond realised that he was looking into the face of a psychopath. He tried again to separate his hands, but without success. Whoever had tied him up had been a professional. As Bond watched, the guard ran his eyes over Holly from head to toe and rinsed his lips again. Bond knew what he was thinking. He turned his head slightly and saw that Holly knew as well. Her eyes were wide open with wary fear, and she was concentrating on the man as if trying to hold him at arm's length. Bond saw that there was no more point in feigning unconsciousness, so he opened his eyes. The throbbing behind his left temple was like an ice pick hitting at his brain. A wave of pain like a meth drinker's hangover swirled through his head. Like a child in a strange nursery, the guard felt in one of the pockets alongside the bunks and withdrew a slim leather case. He clicked it open, and a glint of steel matched the crazed light that came into his eyes. The bitten fingers delved into the case and emerged with a long-bladed scalpel. Bond saw Holly flinch. "Don't cut yourself." Bond's remark was intended to divert attention to himself, but it did not succeed. The guard scowled at him, and then glanced lovingly at the blade before returning his attention to Holly. Bond looked about him desperately. Just above his feet, in the corner by the door, was an upright fire extinguisher clipped to the wall. Bond wondered if he could reach it with his feet. Before him, the guard bathed his shiny lips and leant forward to Holly with the scalpel in his outstretched hand. She twisted her head to one side and tensed her body in terror as the blade slipped beneath one of the straps of her evening gown and severed it with a swift movement. Bond jerked his body forward and drove upwards with his feet. A toe collided with the base of the fire extinguisher and the plunger was depressed. With a noise like an egg being broken, a miniature volcano of foam erupted to splash off the ceiling and over the occupants of the ambulance. The guard swung round to see what had happened, and then, too late, spun back again. He turned just in time to see Bond's feet driving for his face. The blow connected with the side of his jaw, and he crashed backwards against the doors, dropping the scalpel to the floor. As it slithered towards Holly, she withdrew her bound hands from beneath the restraining strap and twisted with all her strength to pick it up. Her fingers closed around the handle, and she held it out desperately towards Bond. He reached out his tied hands, and with 2 slashes from Holly, his arms were free at the cost of a nicked wrist. As the stunned guard launched himself forward again, Bond stopped him with a vicious right jab and tore at the strap that held him to the stretcher. He freed himself and joined battle with the guard as Holly swung wildly but unavailingly with the scalpel. Bond's ankles were still bound, but he struggled upright and pinned the guard against the swaying wall of the ambulance as the man drove his knee up. Bond parried the blow and connected with the soft left of the jaw that spun him around. At that instant, the ambulance jolted over a pothole, and the guard plunged backwards onto the stretcher with all Bond's weight on him. With a sharp crack, the stretcher broke free from its moorings and crashed against the doors. As Holly screamed, they burst open and the stretcher carrying both men plunged out into a cloud of dust. Bond felt the breath leave the guard's body as it absorbed the impact, and he rolled sideways to end up lying by the side of a dirt road. When he stood up, the ambulance had disappeared and there was no sign of the stretcher. The dust began to clear, and he took a few faltering steps down the road. A hillside became visible, falling away to the left, and halfway down it, facing a main road from which the track had branched off, was a large advertising hoarding. The back of the stretcher projected from a hole in the bottom of the hoarding. The poster showed a pretty stewardess and the words, "British Airways, we'll take more care of you." On the wide expanse of pampas, the 3 figures in gaucho costume riding abreast would have attracted attention from tourists. But tourists were a commodity that the region lacked. It was grazing land to the east of the Mato Grosso and behind the Serra de Roncador. Indifferent grazing land where men who scratched a living had to be as tough as the horses they rode and the cattle they branded. Brasilia to the southeast had the modern architecture and the embassies. They had the saddle sores and the mosquitoes. One of the riders gestured down a shallow valley, and the three horsemen rode towards a long, low building with a red-tiled roof and tidy squares of grazing land marked out by picket fences. A flock of white doves took off as they galloped into the courtyard, and peeling shutters creaked in the hot sun. The red dust settled as the men slid from their horses and flicked the reins round the bar of the hitching rail. Two of the men walked along the veranda. The third and tallest pushed open the swing doors and went into the building. The room he entered had bare whitewashed walls and was cool thanks to a high ceiling and a slowly turning fan. A staccato clatter ended as the man came in, and Miss Moneypenny looked up from her typewriter. Why, if it isn't the magnificent 007? Bond swept off his hat and beat some dust from his chaparejos. Mind not to reason why, Moneypenny? Is M expecting me? He's champing at the bit. She looked up at him with an expression of amused affection and nodded towards the door behind her. Bond squared his shoulders and moved forward. One of these days, Moneypenny, I'm going to put you across my knee. One of these days I'm going to love it. She blew him a kiss as he opened the door. Bond found himself in a square courtyard. The first thing he smelt was cordite. Somebody had been firing weapons. Shattered fragments of human figures were strewn across the ground. Against a bullet-pocked wall, a man sat with a poncho pulled around his shoulders and a sombrero tipped over his face so that it was invisible. He gave the impression that he was shutting out the sight of the firing squad that faced him with rifles raised. An order rang out and there was a burst of gunfire, but not from the firing squad. At the word of command, the sombrero tipped up and the poncho parted to reveal an automatically controlled machine gun which mowed down the clay figures of the firing squad and made a further contribution to the debris in the courtyard. Ah, there you are, 007. Q hove into view wearing his tropical working uniform of bush jacket and baggy shorts. He was followed by a harassed assistant clutching a clipboard who looked as if he had difficulty in keeping up with his master. In this respect, he was not alone. Good day, Q. Be with you in just a minute. Q paused to watch a gaucho whirling a bolus above his head. The weapon was released to sail across the courtyard and wrap the balls around the neck of a much-decorated general with a smorgasbord of medal ribbons across his chest and one arm raised in a fascist salute. The balls exploded and the general's head disappeared. In its place was a jagged hole which revealed the neck opening of the plaster bust. Q turned to his assistant. Have that ready for Army Day. This is all very fascinating, Q, but I think Q held up a restraining hand. Just a minute, 007. This really is interesting. He nodded to his assistant, who broke off from making hectic notes on his clipboard and signalled to a man dressed like a security guard who was holding a slim cylindrical torch. The torch was levelled at a second man, and a brilliant strobe light flashed intermittently from its head. As Bond watched horrified, the target melted away like a candle placed on a hot griddle. Bond knew that he was looking at a wax dummy, but the fearful destructive potential of the strobe torch inspired awe and dread. Right, said Q cheerfully. Rather splendid, isn't it? Bond said nothing, but wondered if scientists were born with a scaled-down range of human feelings in order to make room for extra quantities of grey matter. There was something unnerving about the whole of this backwards camp for espionage, infiltration and sabotage. Q, in his silly-ass English way, could have taught the CIA a few lessons. Behind the courtyard was a stone building with shuttered windows and an armed guard outside the door. Q opened the door and ushered Bond inside. The room was in near darkness and set up with a slide projector and a screen as if for an illustrated talk. On one wall was a large map of Brazil that stretched from floor to ceiling. M switched off a desk light and rose hurriedly to his feet as Bond came in. Morning, 007. I'm glad you could make it. We were beginning to get worried about you. Bond noted that all trace of this worry had disappeared from M's voice. Any news of Holly, sir? Dr. Goodhead? The use of the official title was almost a reprimand for familiarity. I'm afraid not. The CIA haven't picked up anything either. She must be held somewhere. If she had not been murdered, thought Bond. And Drax? He's gone to Earth. He left Venice for a destination unknown. We don't even know how he went. Suspicious, said Bond. To us, yes, but not to anyone else. He could have gone to the country for a few days. There's still nothing official to connect him with the disappearance of the Moonraker. And why should he steal his own shuttle? Bond frowned uncomfortably. Damned if I know, sir. All I do know is that he's cooking up something pretty unpleasant. I can feel it in my bones. Regrettably, your bones can't be used as evidence in a court of law, said M dryly. He turned to Q. I think we'd better move on to what Q has to show us. That might throw some light on the matter. Q moved to the projector and indicated a couple of chairs beside him. We're talking about the analysis of the file you picked up in Venice, 007. Your diagnosis was spot on. A highly toxic nerve gas capable of causing death in seconds. But, and this is very strange, none of the experiments we've conducted show it to have any effect on animals. Bond digested the information with a growing sense of unease. What about the formula? Q fiddled with a tray of slides and a formula was projected onto the screen. Bond studied it for several seconds. Most of the chemical symbols meant nothing to him, but there were two words that struck a particular incongruous note. Orchidaceae nigra. He looked towards Q for confirmation. Is that really some kind of orchid? Q nodded. A very rare one. It once grew in great numbers in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, but was believed to have become extinct until very recently. Then a missionary brought one back from the upper reaches of the Amazoko. A long way from the Yucatan Peninsula, mused Bond. Most decidedly, said M. He approached the wall map and circled an area with a blue chinograph pencil. Bond studied the map and the tortuous passage of the river to the sea. So this is the only place in the world where this particular element of the nerve gas can be found? As far as we know, yes. Bond considered. And we have no information about where those cargo planes were flying to from San Pietro Airport. Surely they must have been logged. Only 2 flights were logged, to Bahia and Recife. They were carrying maintenance teams to overhaul equipment on Drax installations. Nothing unusual. Holly saw 6 planes taking off. There's no record of that, 007. That's the important thing. Those planes, however many there were, could be anywhere. They don't have to land at civil airports. The jungle abounds with strips servicing logging camps and mining operations. Bond's eyes returned to the circle of blue on the map. So this is all we really have to go on. I'd better take a look. We think so, said M soberly. He turned to Q. Your department has, I believe, developed something that should assist 007 in his task. Not for the first time, said Q almost petulantly. What would be new would be if Bond could avoid destroying it almost immediately after he'd signed for it. Hours later, Bond thought of Q's words as he sat at the helm of the sleek vessel he had nicknamed the Q-Craft. It had the lines of a motor launch, but with an exceptionally shallow draft. A powerful engine and a brightly coloured awning stretching above his head like the wings of a bird. The river up which he travelled was the colour of mud, and tall, foliage-strangled trees crowded the banks, dangling snake-like lianas into the slowly moving water. The air was full of disembodied bird calls and the hum of mosquitoes. The trees pressed in so menacingly that Bond felt that he and his narrow craft were running a gauntlet, that at any moment the creepers would be wielded like knouts to scourge his back. With the sun locked out and the light fading into the palisade of trees, the river was not a cheerful place. Every foot travelled was one further away from civilization, and the smell of rotting vegetation and the never-ending impression of being fed into a tunnel from which there might be no return pinched the spirit like lead shot. Fighting off the insects, Bond steered a course against the detritus of the forest that came drifting downstream. Hours passed and the river became narrower until the tops of tall trees on either bank almost met across the stream. Clumps of weed began to form untidy barriers, and the Stygian gloom deepened swiftly into the night. Bond moored some distance from the bank and debated between sleeping in the tiny airless cabin and on deck. He decided on the latter and lay down beneath a hastily erected mosquito net to listen to the sounds of darkness. Splashes, rustles, buzzes, burrs, the shrill shrieks of hunting owls, the terrified squawks of their prey. Nature feeding upon itself. Sharp teeth sinking into flesh, and the senses tuned, always tuned to the approach of larger, sharper teeth. Lulled by the sound of nature keeping its bloody balance, Bond eventually fell asleep beneath a starless sky. When he woke up, he was cold, and there was mist upon the water. Somewhere beyond the trees, dawn would soon be breaking, and there was already a premonition of light. A string of stinging welts on his arms and face proved that the mosquito net had been too hastily erected. Bond washed down a handful of paladrin with a swig of old hickory, brought to deal with real emergencies, and started the engine. There was a reciprocating clamour of startled noise from the banks as the Q-Craft broke free of the choking weight of debris that had drifted against the prow during the night and started upstream. Soon Bond had to make a decision. The river ahead was divided by an island of vegetation and disappeared into 2 sluggish channels overhung with trees and choked with weeds and lily leaves like circular green upturned tin lids. Neither seemed promising, but he wondered if he had taken a wrong turning when night had been falling. He examined his hopelessly inadequate chart and took a compass bearing before following the fork that showed a dark line bisecting an open expanse of speckled surface weed. At least somebody had passed this way recently. He cut back the engine and moved gently through beds of thick weed punctuated by areas of open water often littered by flocks of fowl that took to the air with a thunderclap of wings at his approach. Although there were several clumps of vine-covered trees, the waterscape was taking on a far more swamp-like aspect. Not that this acted as a salve to the spirit. There was still a feeling of claustrophobia, of being hemmed in and closed off from the outside world. Not without pangs of alarm, Bond wondered how easy it was going to be to find his way back. He adopted the habit of stopping every few hundred yards to look back and see if there were any memorable landmarks. He soon realized that this was a waste of time. One patch of open water amongst the clumps of reeds looked exactly like another. For half a day, Bond continued without a change of scenery. Then he entered another narrow river winding through the jungle. So serpentine were the bends in the stream here that he was able to look through a gap in the trees and see a second stretch of water running parallel to his. Half an hour later, he had reached the stretch he had seen. Night fell without him being able to make a clear estimate of the distance he had travelled in a straight line. He prepared some rations which, if barely palatable, at least succeeded in destroying his appetite, and passed another fitful night during which refuge in the cabin was forced upon him by torrential rain that started to fall soon after it became dark, and dropped as if from some waterfall in heaven. The next day brought his first contact with human beings. The rain had ceased, and he had got under way upstream when a dug-out canoe appeared round a bend in the river. In it were 5 tiny men wearing strips of cloth around their waists and carrying spears. They dropped their spears when they saw Bond and snatched up paddles. At a speed that was impressive, they dug their paddles into the water and headed in towards the bank to disappear into a side tributary. After that incident, Bond had the impression that he was being watched. Occasionally there were bird calls from the bank that evoked a strident response almost too spontaneous for anything found in nature. Creatures unseen rustled away through the undergrowth. Bond felt his nerves being stretched to breaking point. Oppressive surroundings and a growing sense of isolation wound the capstan. There was nothing to see but the thickening jungle and the winding river, yet he could never relax. A drifting log or a submerged rock causing an accident or a mechanical fault that could be simply repaired within sight of civilization could here be his undoing. And there was always the fear that an arrow or a spear would sail out from the riverbank, that a war canoe would silently steal up on him when he was sleeping. It was a voyage that did not pity faint hearts. By midday on the 4th day, the river disappeared into a sponge of swamp, and Bond's spirits took another dive. There was no discernible current that he could follow, and the thick reeds were taller than the boat. It was like being lost in the bristles of a scrubbing brush. The reeds scraped the sides of the Q-craft and closed in behind. Once again Bond was tortured by the fear that he had taken a wrong channel and was ploughing into some limitless wilderness from which there would be no return. The fuel situation was becoming critical, and he had only his compass to go on. He estimated that he was almost in the area marked by M, but he could not be sure. His last radio contact had been made when leaving the main river, and he judged it unwise to open up the set again in case there was someone or something here to intercept the signal. For an hour he brushed through reed beds that were so thick as to be almost impenetrable, and when the waterscape opened up and clumps of feather-topped cane became islands in a water garden of lilies and flowering tubers, these in turn gave way to stretches of open water bordered by reed and jungle, and containing flocks of cranes and geese that rose into the air as he approached. To see some bird life and be free of the stifling reed beds lifted Bond's spirits, and he opened the throttle slightly to let the Q-craft skim towards what looked like the beginnings of a large lake. The boat emerged from the last clumps of reed and was indeed riding across a wide expanse of water. The surface was smooth and clear, and Bond saw rings that showed where fish were rising. But there were no birds. After the teeming backwaters that he had come through, Bond wondered why. What could there be here to frighten them away? The answer came in the form of a large spout of water that rose just forward of the bow. Bond thought momentarily of some giant fish or crocodile before he heard the telltale screech. He had come under fire. A second shell exploded astern, and he swung the rudder over to head for the shelter of the reed beds. Moving directly towards him with its bow out of the water and cannon blazing was a high-powered speedboat. Bond threw the wheel over again only to see 2 more boats converging on him. The water around the Q-craft was boiling with shellfire. There remained one direction to take, across the lake. Bond opened up the throttle wide and headed for a gap in the trees on the far shore. Behind him the 3 speedboats gave chase. one in advance of the others. Bond studied the control panel of the Q-craft and quickly ran through the instructions he had been given. Poor Q. He produced equipment for every contingency and yet was furious whenever one arose. Bond jabbed a button and there was a clunk from the stern which told him that 2 release chambers had opened. More pressure on the button and 2 cylindrical objects like depth charges were tossed out to float on the surface 20 yards apart. As the first pursuing boat thudded across the water, it steered between them, the helmsman imagining they were mines that would explode on impact. He was right, but not entirely. The mines were also magnetic. As the speedboat passed between them, they leapt from the water like flying fish and slapped against the hull. After a moment's pause, there was a violent explosion which sent a column of orange and yellow flame roaring heavenwards. Wreckage spattered the water and the blasted hull of the launch sank immediately. Bond's tight-lipped expression eased momentarily. 1 down and 2 to go. As he tried to coax some more speed out of his craft, he saw a notch cut out of the jungle ahead where the lake must feed a river. He had an impression of white water. Cannon fires still hammered around his ears and another shell exploded dangerously close. Bond glanced at the controls again. The small lever on the left. That might be the answer. He pulled it down and turned his head to see a thin cigar-shaped torpedo drop into the wake behind the Q-craft. Almost instantly it broke free and veered towards one of the pursuing speedboats like a water snake, the nose just breaking the surface. The helmsman saw the danger and was swift to take evasive action. He steered towards his companion boat and the torpedo swept past the bow. A shout of triumph rose in the air and was quickly stifled. The torpedo made a 180-degree turn and homed in on its prey. Like a dog about to sit down, the launch spun round on itself, but the torpedo was not thrown off. Remorselessly, it closed the gap and the magnetic head smashed into the stern. A second column of flame, smoke and fragments burst into the air and the stricken boat began to settle fast. Now Bond was in the white water at the beginning of the river. Small angry waves thumped against the bottom of the boat and spray broke over the shuddering bows. Bond looked ahead and saw the water becoming more turbulent. He must be entering some rapids. In principle, this should not be too serious. With its high-powered engine and shallow draft, the Q-boat was built for this kind of work. Bond now saw and heard something that froze his heart. Round a bend in the river was a cloud of spray about a quarter of a mile wide and rising at its highest to at least 60 feet. There was also a deep throbbing roar like nothing he had heard before. It could only be a waterfall. A waterfall of such dimensions as to dash to pieces anything that was swept over it. Bond swung the rudder and felt the boat in danger of broaching. A fresh hail of bullets creased the air above his head and shattered the cabin glass. There was no turning back, no steering for the bank. The river was now a boiling flood, the roar even louder. Spray began to drench the boat. Bond squared his jaw and steered straight for the point where it rose highest. Behind him, the last pursuing boat was in difficulties. Horribly aware of what lay ahead, the helmsman had tried to turn back, and the boat had broached. Lying across the stream, it was drifting helplessly at the pace of the water and threatening to capsize at any moment. All attempts at wiping out Bond had been abandoned in the interests of self-preservation, a sentiment that had expressed itself too late. Bond glanced back to see the boat turn on its side and fill with water. It disappeared into the spray. Bond's heart pumped like a steam hammer as he fought to stay in control of his senses and hold the Q-craft head-on to the racing water. The spray stung his face like hail, and the roar of the falls threatened to burst his eardrums. Ahead, the frothing white water was giving way to an apron of smooth cream as the river stretched itself over the lip of the precipice. What lay below was swathed in a heavy pall of mist. Bond's numb fingers reached up and grasped the metal rod that ran beneath the awning of the Q-craft. To the left and right were 2 levers, sculpted close to the shape of the rod. Bond waited and felt the hull of the boat rasp against rock. He was now inside a cloud of spray, and below him was a sudden unnerving glimpse of what lay beyond the falls. It seemed like a great hole in the middle of the earth, down which water from every side was disappearing, a hole so deep as to have no bottom. Bond pulled down the levers and immediately felt the awning come free, and the wind attempt to tear it from his grasp. He clung tightly to the rod, and as the Q-craft tilted over the edge of the falls, what was now apparent as the wing-like structure of a hang glider swept him up over the terrifying drop.